Hello, everybody. Welcome to this edition of Swarajya Conversations, where we discuss interesting ideas and books. Today, with me is J Sai Deepak, engineer turned lawyer turned dharmic warrior turned author, and he has written a great book, India that is Bharat, which discusses coloniality, civilization, and constitution. This is the book. I hope all of you get to buy it and read it. It's a great book. I would certainly recommend it. And our conversation today will go around the key ideas discussed in this book. So, Sai, let me begin before discussing the book. Can you tell us two things of your own personal journey? One, your professional and vocational journey from engineering to law and your interest in dharmic ideas. And second, your part in the Sabarimala case, which seems to have been a trigger for this book. Am I right? So, if you can just confirm the latter and a brief discussion of your journey.
You're right in your observation that Sabarimala arguments were a significant trigger, especially the reactions and the conversations that it generated. The only caveat is I don't know if I'm a dharmic warrior because I don't want to get into any kind of pedestal-related issues. I will simply limit it to the fact that I certainly have an active interest in issues that concern my community and my civilization. To that extent, I would certainly say that I have a fair amount of interest in it. Now, coming to the first part of your question, sir, the switch to law from engineering was certainly triggered by perhaps the troubled decade of 2004 to 2014 significantly. And the kind of, let's say, proto or neo-wokeism that was already on campuses, visible on campuses. Because while we have a word to describe the phenomenon today, the phenomenon was in existence before, at least during my time in college campuses, except that we did not have a specific word that captured the stupidity. And it so happens that not that I bore the brunt of it or anything, but since I was fairly sensitive to these conversations and these discussions, I wasn't sure if I wanted to be a mute spectator who watched this from the sidelines. And I asked myself if I had what it takes to participate in this in some way or the other. And I certainly was sure of one thing, that being an engineer, perhaps I wouldn't be able to participate in these discussions with either some degree of training or experience. So, which is when I started asking a question of myself as to whether I wanted to remain an engineer for the rest of my life, or would I want to qualify myself in some kind of, let's say, a degree which gives me an exposure to how the system works and gives me a ringside view of the system. I had two standard options. One was, of course, the more standard option of civil services, which a lot of engineers certainly aspired for, even in my generation. This is between 2002 to 2006. Except that perhaps I'm a bit too outspoken for the system. And I realized that perhaps I would need to equip myself with something different. And that's when IIT Kharagpur had launched this program, which is LLB with a specialization in intellectual property rights, which is the standard LLB with another about 7 to 8 papers thrown in specifically for specialization in IPR. And given that most engineers, at least in my generation, were suckers for the IIT brand, I certainly wanted to take up this particular program. I did a fair bit of research, and it was easy for me to sell this LLB program to my parents and family, other than, let's say, compared to any other LLB program, because the stereotype being that if you were to become a lawyer in the South, then perhaps you're going to be riding a Hercules cycle with mismatched Hawaii chapels. So that was the perception that most people in my family certainly had. So I made the transition, and I'm happy that I made the transition in 2006. So I'm a product of the first batch of the IIT Kharagpur Law School, which is known as the Rajiv Gandhi School of Intellectual Property Law. I'm not sure what he had to do with Rajiv. I mean, he had to do with intellectual property rights, but nevertheless. So that was the name of the law school. And after that, I've been in the profession for 12 years now. My strengths are primarily civil commercial litigation, competition law, intellectual property rights, and constitutional law, of course. So these are my limited areas of expertise, or at the very least, core competence, if not expertise.
Right. India that is Bharat, the title of your book suggests and invests a lot of meaning in the name Bharat, and you use it consistently throughout the book.
Yes.
But looking at the constitutional debates, do you think the insertion of the word Bharat was just a concession to some of those traditionalists on the Constituent Assembly, or was it really a thought through something deeper, imbuing it with a deeper sense of the connectedness with 5,000 years of heritage?
Right. At the outset, the introduction of Bharat in Article 1 was not Dr. Ambedkar's contribution.
Yeah.
The original draft that he presented certainly had no reference to Bharat whatsoever. It simply had the word India. India shall be a union of states. That was the original draft, which was, of course, the draft based on Sri B.N. Rao's original draft, which was refined because, contrary to popular perception that Dr. Ambedkar is somehow the father of the Indian Constitution, while we may believe so, the fact is the original draft was prepared by Benegal Narsingh Rao.
Yeah.
So, therefore, the original draft presented by Dr. Ambedkar certainly had no reference to Bharat. When the draft was presented to the Constituent Assembly, Lokanath Mishra and a raft of other people effectively proposed suggestions to the effect of saying, at the very least, have both India and Bharat, if you believe that Bharat alone should not be there. And so when the article was again presented before the Constituent Assembly at the fag end of its discussions, you see, Article 1 was actually finalized at the fag end of the discussions of the Constituent Assembly, not at the outset itself. Because they said that since the idea of Pakistan is something that is still underway, and we don't know which way this is going to go, and when we use words like Bharat, we have to consider the fact that there are several communities that live here, so on and so forth. So therefore, this discussion was sparked for the end of the Assembly's discussion after everything else was done. And at that stage, when it was again presented before the Assembly, Dr. Ambedkar, to be fair to him, introduced Bharat as part of Article 1, and which was taken up for debates. And during the course of the debate, it was very clear that quite a few people were certainly in favor of the use of Bharat, and they were very clear about why they were using it. They were citing, if I could call them, civilizational sources as opposed to traditional sources. They cited civilizational primary sources to support this particular, let's say, Namakaranam, so to speak. And they were very, very clear about the fact that Bharat is the successor state to the Indic civilization. That is something that they were certainly clear about. From the geographical origins of Bharat and its metes and bounds, which are drawn from the Brahmanas and other places, they specifically discussed all of that as part of the Constituent Assembly debates. The one thing that certainly comes through when one reads through the debates relating to this particular provision is that Dr. Ambedkar certainly displayed a fair bit of impatience in hearing, let's say, views in support of Bharat, views which certainly wanted Bharat to be included.
Right.
Be that as it may, perhaps that I've said this before, it could be the lawyer's impatience who basically says, come to the point, don't beat around the bush. Okay. Is this the forum where you wish to have all these discussions? You wanted Bharat, Bharat is included. What is left to be discussed further? So that could have been the sense in which he was being impatient. So one is not sure of it. Be that as it may, significant number of framers were certainly conscious of why they were using it. The only thing that I've been very cautious about saying in the book is that on the basis of this, we shouldn't come to the conclusion that Bharat is a civilization state. That would be a very short-sighted and myopic conclusion.
Yeah. So, just coming to the subtitle, Coloniality, Civilization, Constitution, I think you have divided your thing into a trilogy where you have, this is the first part, right?
Yes.
But the last two parts have largely to do with Constitution, or do they deal with all three again?
So the last two parts will be the actual parts which deal with the Constitution significantly, where I will continue to use the first two sections of the current book as the lenses. But the focus will be entirely on the application of those lenses on the Constitution and its framing.
Right. So the one thing, I don't think we have crossed the first hurdle yet on trying to get rid of our colonial lenses. I mean, decoloniality is some distance away. If anything, our elites now appear even more mentally colonized than they were in 1947.
Right.
And they are now using fault lines within our own society to make coloniality the norm by trying to drive a wedge between our peoples.
Correct.
So our constitution makers at least had the courage of their civilizational convictions to call India Bharat and draw pictures from our epics in the original constitutional document. Most of our institutions also draw from our heritage. We have the national emblem saying Satyameva Jayate, which came from an Upanishad. Supreme Court's own motto was say Yato Dharmastato Jayaha. But a few years ago, some character, I believe, faked an outrage and said that the Supreme Court had changed its motto from Satyameva Jayate to Yato Dharmastato Jayaha. I mean, we seem to be dragging the country back to coloniality rather than away from it.
Correct.
So, do you think that we have a huge task ahead in just dealing with the first part of it, the coloniality, rather than doing understanding the civilization in all its aspects, and then doing something about it in the constitution?
Right. So I would basically posit that if you try and deal with coloniality, and at the very least you start with a very clear acknowledgement of its existence, of colonial consciousness,
Yeah.
and you try to remove those layers, there's a decent chance that aspects relating to civilization become much clearer to yourself, simply because then the facts start speaking to you and history starts, let's say, interacting with you. So I don't see this as a silo-based approach where you have to first remove the colonial layer and then hopefully get into the civilizational aspect. In fact, I think it's a simultaneous process.
Right.
The faster and the closer you are to removing colonial consciousness, which infects your psychology and your ability to think, so to speak, I think the closer you are going to be to your roots. Because the idea, and this is something that I've tried to caveat in multiple places, just so that my position is not mischievously extrapolated. Decoloniality is certainly not a call for celebration of eternal victimhood. I'm not asking us to say, keep crying for the rest of your lives that we are victims and we're victims. That's not my position.
Yeah.
Second, it's certainly not my position that somehow this is an attempt to bring back the past in all its glory.
Yeah.
Okay. That's certainly not the intent here. The idea is to basically say, if you believe that your history has had some value and that your society is not entirely, let's say, cannot be reduced to caste, dowry, and let's say sati pratha, jati pratha, and everything, and
Right.
even let's say these are versions that we subscribe to on the basis of colonialized versions of history. So if you believe that there is truly something of value, you have to show that by actually walking the talk, by drawing from that repository and reservoir in active policy and lawmaking. That is the submission.
Right.
If dharma is reduced to an ornamental construct, then you might as well say that I will use this effectively for tokenism and symbolism, but it is of no practical application.
Yeah. So, one thing, isn't that a prerequisite if you're going to get decoloniality accepted as a reality from which we need to develop something? The first thing we need is actually a new lexicon. In a sense, most concepts used by us today have an exclusively or largely Christian context. Take the word secularism, where it came from. It came from a European history, Christian history, right? On the other hand, words which have a specific meaning in Sanskrit or in Indian languages, or in Tamil or in Hindi, have been translated into into English wrongly. I mean, you said Atma is soul, and I think Rajiv Malhotra has written an entire book on Sanskrit non-translatables. Do you think we first need to compile this kind of a new lexicon of thing where we decolonize our words and phrases first?
So any word which certainly has a conceptual connotation, it would help if we were to try and use our own language for it. So for instance, if the English language has shown itself to be capable of accommodating words like guru, avatar, mantra, chutzpah, whatnot from, let's say, the Jewish language, let's say from Hebrew to other languages, why can't we populate English with our languages and words from our languages to the extent that we are dealing with our own institutions, practices, and customs at the very least? Okay. Right. So, for instance, when we speak of a religious denomination in the context of Article 26 of the Constitution, one of the things that we're trying to say is that please, sampradaya, at least when you speak of Indic institutions. Okay. Right. And when we speak of religion, please translate it to dharma at the very least as far as Hindus are concerned. Although it is certainly not equatable and it cannot be synonymous with religion under any circumstances. Right. So, in fact, I've dealt with these aspects not from a translation perspective, but from the perspective of what is known as colonial linguistics. Okay. Yeah. Which is to say, every word which is being used by the colonizer is not a word that stands alone on its own 2 feet. It has its own history and connotation, which it carries with it. So when you use the word modern, try and replace it with current and contemporary, because the word modern has a very distinct Eurocentric connotation to it, which is terrible for indigenous societies like Bharat societies. So while I have not written Mr. Malhotra's book, Non-Translatables or Untranslatables, I've certainly drawn from Dr. Balagangadhara's work on this particular issue. Correct. To basically say that the priest becomes Brahmin or Brahmin becomes the priest. Okay. And you simply reduce a temple to a place of worship because you don't understand any of the concept when it actually has several aspects to it and several sides to it. Right. And so immediately are deities, and what is the distinction between deity and God? Okay, the deification of a certain form of energy. What are its rights, and what is the epistemology, not theology, epistemology behind it? These
Right.
are aspects which cannot be understood unless there is a change in the language in the first place. So, at the very least, if you are struggling to replace English, there must be a hybrid form of language that we must certainly conceive of in order to ensure that indigenous consciousness, as reflected by indigenous languages, can certainly be reflected when English is the lingua franca, so to speak.
Right. Yeah. So coming to the European context, you talked about how the Protestant movement, Lutheranism, Calvinism, had a huge impact on the way the colonizers, used their history to impose them on other peoples, whether it's in South America or, for that matter, in India. But of course, South America is different because it's substantially been Christianized.
Correct.
But when we talk about Indian context, I mean, the Lutherans and all had a problem with the Catholic Church and the clergy who they felt abused their power. So they straight away translated their experience into this anti-Brahmanism, or assuming that Brahmins must be doing the same here.
Correct.
Is that what we are trying to see? Or and related question is, given the fact that our primary colonizer came from a Protestant country, that is the British, and not, say, the French Catholics or the Portuguese Catholics, who were also colonizers in parts of India. How come was the Protestant movement become the primary determinant of how they view other cultures, especially India?
Correct. So two things, sir. One is that while we've had the Portuguese come first, and then we've had Germans come in the form of mercenaries, and then we have had the French come to this place. We have had the British were relatively later entrants as far as Bharat is concerned. This much is clear, that regardless of the identity of the European colonizer, the national identity of the European colonizer, Protestantism as a movement had taken significant root, and it had started influencing their approach to colonized societies significantly. And it's not something that is specifically and exclusively attributable only to the British. Okay. The one thing that had become very, very clear is that Catholicism also was competing with the radical Protestant Reformation wave. Okay. So it wanted to find ways of retaining its space and also partake certain elements of Protestantism itself. Okay. Because once you come to the conclusion that Catholicism is orthodox and Protestantism is modern, therefore, again, orthodoxy has to try and compete with, let's say, Christian modernity in that particular sense and try to take certain elements.
Right.
Because what is it that they're fighting for? They're fighting for their flock, for their parish, for their sheep, so to speak, and for their adherents. And every colonized society effectively represented a potential battleground for Christian denominational fights. Okay. It's because everybody wanted to be the defender of the faith, the true faith. Okay. So that is certainly there. Now, the point that you make with respect to the projection of Protestant values and Protestant experience onto colonized societies, you're 100% correct, at least insofar as Bharat is concerned, which I deal with significantly in both sections 1 and section 2, but certainly in section 2, where I say that the anti-clericalism of Protestant Reformation was carried forward and projected onto colonized societies. And they started looking for villains who were in the same mold, according to them, as the Roman Catholic Church. And therefore, Buddhism, Jainism, Sikhism were seen as Indic reformations to, or let's say, challenges to Brahminism, so to speak. And Brahmins being the equivalents of the Roman Catholic Church. So all the stereotypes associated with the Roman Catholic priests, such as them being lecherous, gluttonous, corrupt, and institutions being dens of vices and corruption, all of that was transposed and imposed onto Indic institutions, which they felt were Brahminical institutions. The fact that even in those times, a significant number of these institutions were controlled by more than one community is something that they could not wrap their heads around. And unfortunately, we seem to be taking that particular legacy forward whenever we have discussions around these institutions.
Yeah. And even when you're talking about Brahmins and priests, the priest in West Bengal is hardly the same as the priest in Kerala, or for that matter in Tamil Nadu. I mean, there is significant, ritual and other differences, even within this small so-called clergy as they see it.
Correct.
Yeah. So, in your book, some parts of it, later parts, you talk about the impact of the League of Nations ideology and also the Montagu-Chelmsford reforms as precursors to both the Government of India Act of 1919 and even the final institutional, the Constitutional, Assembly, which also grew from some of those ideas. Then the 1935 Act, all those things are there.
Right.
Now, how did this happen despite the presence of so many rooted and non-deracinated Hindus in the Constitutional Assembly?
So, just to clarify,
going from League of Nations to 1919, 1935, and 1950, what is the sort of dotted line that connects them all?
Correct. So, the line that connects the Government of India Act of 1919 with the Government of India Act of 35, and then, of course, the Constitution of 1950, that analysis is something that I will undertake in the second book. So, what I've done as far as this particular book is concerned is to clearly show that the origins of contemporary constitutionalism, apart from being European in nature, they also had a very clear civilizing character to it, which is to say, the instrumentality of constitution was meant to serve two purposes. One, to establish a nation state model in colonies, point number one, and therefore to establish their civilized status is point number two. And three, if they were not as civilized as Europeans expected them to be, then the constitution was seen as the instrumentality of ushering reform and civilization. That much is something is very, very clear from the Montagu-Chelmsford report, which is the Montfort report. Yeah. And I extract several portions. The thing is, each time we discuss the constitution, our discussions either start with the Constituent Assembly and they at best go to the administrative aspects or infrastructural aspects set up by the European. We don't ask ourselves what is the political theology within which this particular infrastructure operates. And that is the central, let's say, lens through which I look at these aspects. So even when I start writing the second book, I am not going to be interested in states, state list, central list. All of that is already there as part of the 1919 Act, which is what the 1935 Act takes forward. The question is, their notions of our society and what is it that they wanted to turn this particular society into, is that thought process carried forward in 1935 and the Constituent Assembly is the central question that I'll try and address. So here what I've done is the usual discussion about Minto-Morley reforms, representative councils, legislative councils. I've completely done away with those discussions. I said, okay, there may be representative institutions. I'm not on that particular question. My question is, what was the goal towards which this entire infrastructure was geared towards? Now, the best part is, I don't have to speculate. I don't have to indulge in conjecture. They have beautifully captured that in their own British Parliament debates. They have captured that intention as part of the report on Indian constitutional reforms, which was the Montfort report. Yeah. All of this is captured in their own conclusions, in their own words. So what I have done is that I've said, this is the intent or the premise on the basis of which the colonizer operates, that I've set out in section 1. And then I've cited their debates in the context of Bharat to say, he has not changed his mind when it comes to Bharat. So let us not sit and assume that the establishment that was set up in Bharat by the European colonizer was a secular establishment. It was a Christian secular establishment. That much is very clear. Correct. Now, the important clarification which I think is warranted is, on significant aspects of conceptual argument, so to speak, I have drawn from the works of Dr. Jacob B. Ruwer as well as Dr. Balagangadhara and the scholarship of Latin American scholars. But I believe my central contribution is that I have placed primary resources for the direct reading of the readers by extracting from the British parliamentary debates, by extracting from several correspondences, and including letters from the Bureau of Education Records published in 1834. So what I've basically done is that, as opposed to giving anybody the opportunity to say that I'm driven by a confirmation bias and there's an agenda that I'm trying to push, I'm saying I don't need to push any agenda. The facts speak for themselves. That's and they are trying to capture everything in the language that we understand today, which is English. So lo and behold, this is what they've said.
This is what they've said. Yeah. So you also, towards the end, you discuss about the European setting the standard for what constitutes civilized conduct.
Correct.
Now, to what extent do you think they lived up to their own standard? One, and can there be some kind of Indian set of standards that either can evolve, or do you think it needs to be a multiple set of standards, because we start from a position of diversity and plurality, not from a centralized church that decides what is the absolute benchmark you have to jump over.
Right.
So how does the standard setting happen in their context, and do we need to adopt something like that, or forget about it?
So the one thing that is very, very clear, and this is something that I've captured in chapter 4 and chapter 11. Chapter 4 is part of section 1, and chapter 11 is the final chapter in section 3.
Right.
Where I've said that standard of civilization was, first of all, a consensual framework, but the participants of the consensus were members of the Christian European civilization. Okay. Correct. So international law is not law which is international in nature, but law which is internationalized, but is provincial in nature. Okay. Yeah. European provincial standards of civilization and their notions of what constitutes rule of law, their notions of what constitutes good practices or a good society or a civilized society, were sought to be internationalized through the colonization project. And every nation that effectively wanted to transact with these countries, so to speak, had to reshape themselves to fit the European mold. Okay.
Right.
And then I go on to explain how the standard of civilization was not just an economic yardstick or a benchmark, or just a malleable cultural benchmark. It ultimately became a legal prerequisite, which was specifically codified in international instruments, including the League of Nations. The Covenant Article 22 is something that I refer to. And I also draw attention to Articles 9 and 38 of the ICJ statute to say that this was prevalent not just in the League of Nations, the founding of League of Nations. It played an active role in the conception and the institution of the United Nations also. Okay. So therefore, the standard of civilization, they're crystal clear in all their speeches, is standard of Christian civilization. They don't try to dumb it down. They don't try to water it down at all. Now, what is it that Bharat can do? Firstly, I think, notwithstanding the fact that there is a significant amount of panthic diversity or Sampradayic diversity within us, at least scholars seem to be on the same page that Dharma seems to be the common glue that ties all of this. Okay. Now, on what constitutes dharma for the purposes of standard setting of civilization, frankly speaking, I am not in a position to comment on that because I think that requires expertise. Yeah. Somebody like Dr. Nagaraj Paturi should be the person to be commenting on this particular subject. Right. I am limiting myself to the point that if you accept that international law is significantly a product of internationalization of European provincial standards, you have to ask yourself a simple question. If you wish to lay claim to the position of a Vishwa Guru, do you want to live by other standards, or do you want to lay down a few standards yourself? Or at the very least, do you have the intention of asking for a seat at the table where standards are laid down to say, I need to be heard and I need to be a participant, not a passive recipient?
Right. So nothing can be called universal unless the entire, all the peoples of the universe agree to it without being slaves to a different standard. Yeah.
At least a cross-section of them.
Right. There are two things I want to discuss. Do you think that the UN's Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and of course, much later in about 10, 12 years back, there was the Mauritius Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People. Right. Do you think the former is more of a Eurocentric idea and the latter more an inclusive one based on an understanding of civilizational status of multiple peoples?
No, sir. So in fact, what I've done is that I said, and my book ends with the promise that I will be discussing the application of standard of modernity and standard of human rights. Because the first wave is standard of civilization, the second wave is standard of modernity, the third wave is standard of human rights, which I'll discuss in the next book. But what I very clearly said is the human rights template that we follow today is a secularized Christian template because it sees itself primarily as a product of the Enlightenment. And the claim that the Enlightenment was a break from the Christian religion is completely debunked by scholarship, which clearly says, no, it was a beta version of secular Christianity.
Right.
Okay. And therefore, it was an attempt to establish a modern version of Christianity, not a Christian or non-Christian society, so to speak. So that's point number one. Second, the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples is something of 2007 that I discussed specifically as part of the book, where I discuss the question of how tribes are defined. Okay. And how the conception itself is colonial in nature, as a consequence of which yardsticks that are supposed to be applied to those nations where there are huge, significant settler European populations like Argentina, Australia, are being applied to Bharat. And we are being treated as a substitute to the European colonizer, as if we are the Aryan colonizers and there are Mool Nivasis and Adivasis, so to say.
Yeah, okay. Right.
So the European guilt complex with respect to colonization
Has been thrust
is being passed on to us.
Yeah.
Where national so-called majority communities are treated as colonizers, and the tribal communities are being equated with religious minorities, which couldn't have been a greater travesty in the case of Bharat.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct.
So just to say that a tribal member of the tribal community shall be treated as a Hindu for the purposes of reservations under SC/ST Act. Okay, or SC/ST reservations. But they will be they'll be put in the same basket as religious minorities when it comes to treatment. Okay, that is the problem. So I clearly say that this is so mischievous that India should have actually objected to it, clearly saying, they are part of us. They are an organic part of us.
Right.
And you can't apply colonial categories of tribe on us, because what do we do? Now, there is a different form of colonization that has happened, which is to say, tribe has been accepted as the word, and we are finding translations for tribe even in Hindi, which is Janjati. Okay. Or you come out with Adivasi and so on and so forth. Whereas we should be saying, we don't subscribe to either the concept of Adivasi or a Janjati. According to us, they are Panchamas, which is people who are outside the Chaturvarna system. Okay. Simply because they belong to the hills and the jungles, a different set of rules and a code of conduct applies to them. As opposed to taking the position, we have accepted the norm called tribe, which is why this entire mischief. And I've also pointed out one thing, that even in the most progressive, inclusive of your international instruments that deal with the rights of indigenous peoples, there is not one word against the role of Christian missionaries in trying to convert them.
Yeah, correct.
Okay. So in the 2007 declaration, international interference is guaranteed so that signatories comply with the standards. But what is the step or what is the measure which is envisaged as part of this particular structure and framework to prevent conversion of tribal communities, so to speak, from their way of life to the Christian way of life and appropriation of their culture? There is not a whisper of it. Okay. So I have called these instruments Eurocentric solutions to Eurocentric problems.
Okay. Right. My understanding was it was slightly different. I thought it referred to all pagan pre-Abrahamic religions and not just tribes.
Right.
Okay. So anyway, that was my mistake. Anyway, sorry. Coming to the next question, since we say that our ideas about nationhood have come from the Westphalian one, which too emerged from the religious ideologies of the church and its reformation in the European context, right?
Correct.
But how would you go around defining a civilizational state? I mean, a civilization can comprise several states, which was the case before 1947. And even today, it's the case with, say, the Arab Islamic civilization. And a state, on the other hand, a state like, say, India, could actually include multiple civilizations if you define them either in religious terms or whatever it is. So, where does that leave India, that is Bharat, in the context of both being a civilization state or a state with several civilizations?
So, in terms of the first question, which is to say whether we are a civilizational state, I have taken the position that I am undecided whether we are a civilization state, because I would like to understand whether this was the intention of the framers of the Constitution, and therefore the second part will cover it. But I've very clearly taken the position that merely because a state as an apparatus presides over a society which is a civilization, it doesn't lend the character of a civilization state to the state itself. That is too simplistic an extrapolation to make, which defies both logic and civilizational studies per se. Okay.
Right.
So I'm on the question of whether we are a civilization state, I'm taking the position that I'm agnostic as on date. Okay.
Right.
Because at least in conduct, that's not how we seem to be operating. Okay.
Yeah.
But whether the Constitution sees us that way is a question that I will answer later. Now, on whether we are a civilization or an agglomeration of civilizations, I clearly take the position, citing expert literature and very clearly standing on the shoulders of giants, that we satisfy the fundamental requirements of a civilization in terms of scale, diversity, and unity. And what constitutes the building blocks of this unity, I have identified a triple matrix of nature, faith, and geography. Okay. Specifically saying that we have chosen to sanctify certain places, and we have universalized that sanctification, or that, let's say, the treatment within this particular community or within this particular civilization.
Right.
So Badrinath is equally sacred to someone in the north as it is to someone in the south. Okay. So Chidambaram is equally sacred to someone in the north as it is to someone in the south. Okay. So a sense of allegiance, regardless of your specific geographic location, is the genius of this particular civilization, so to speak. So I cite literature to that particular effect.
Right.
Now, coming to whether we are multiple civilizations, we may be multiple civilizations only because of the factum of twin colonizations.
Yeah.
Which is the Middle Eastern colonization and the Christian colonization.
That's right. Correct.
And I say this not from a racial perspective, I say this from a consciousness perspective.
Right.
Which is to say, what is it that you believe in, regardless of which race you come from?
Yeah.
Okay. Because the idea is to say, if you turn this into an ethnocentric discussion, tomorrow this entire country could become Christian or Muslim. And then they might say, no, this is equally indigenous because it's the same race which is converted. That is not the stupid argument that I wish to buy into.
Correct.
I am making the clear point that if there's a change of conscience and there's a change of religious affiliation, automatically your focus of allegiance also changes, simply because all loyalties with respect to the Hindu Dharma are within this particular geography, or at best in Pakistan and Afghanistan. But even then, we relate primarily to this particular country. Whereas if you come from, let's say, the Christian faith or the Muslim faith, your focus of loyalty and fealty are not within this particular geography, so to speak. Yeah. Including, for instance, if it were to be the church establishment, appointments of people in the church in Bharat are controlled by people outside. Okay. Yeah. So I'm not willing to actually treat this as part of an indigenous civilization. Right. I'm only going to say it is an accommodated consciousness because of a constitutional consensus.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct.
Which the majority has taken in its magnanimity, and not because this was this was meant to be treated as something which is divinely ordained. This we decided as a society. So while we may be a multi-civilizational society, our core identity remains the Dharmic identity and the Bharatiya identity, which is why we retained Bharat as the word for India. And you chose that particular name for Bharat, which preceded both the Middle Eastern colonization and the Christian colonization.
Yeah, right. So basically, it's not very different. I mean, I'm not saying ideologically it's the same, but both Savarkar and Ambedkar also broadly accepted this basic idea, right? Yeah.
So I wanted to make this case independent of Savarkar and Ambedkar.
I know.
So I completely agree with you. So in terms of the position, I'm not taking too different a position. Yeah. I'm merely saying that this position can be arrived at independent of them.
That's right. Correct. Yeah. So basically, under European and Islamic colonialism, African culture and heritage has been more or less gone, and Africans have been dismembered even before they could understand the issue of decoloniality. Huh?
Correct.
Right. Now, do you think we can avoid such a fate, given the global forces that seem to be ranged against us?
I believe that ever since the 7th or 8th century, and at least from the 17th century, global forces have been ranged against us.
Yeah.
It just so happens that because of the connectivity and the dissemination of information, perhaps there is a greater sense of being under siege than we were then. That's one. And second, since there was active resistance, both physical and mental, at least until the independence, so to speak, I think the civilization was not lulled into a false sense of comfort until then.
Yeah.
The reason why we feel under greater siege today is because the society is being asked to continue its deep slumber through education, through public discourse, through constitutional discourse, and through every other form of discourse. And we are being constantly told that there is something fundamentally wrong about you, therefore you need to be reformed out of your identity, so to speak. And the unfortunate reality is people subscribing to an alien worldview also say the same thing, and people subscribing to the so-called indigenous worldview are also saying the same thing. So, which is exactly proof of colonial consciousness. That you seem to be speaking the same language and the same tone and the same idiom of the colonizer, except you believe you're doing it for my good. Okay, so you have convinced yourself of the end goal. Your reasons may vary from that of the colonizer, but the end goal is the same, and the end fate that I'm expected to meet is to give up what belongs to me, which is my identity. Okay. So as far as I'm concerned, assuming that we succeed significantly, or at least to some extent, in the decolonial endeavor, the civilization will find better tools and stronger tools, and at the very least, a stronger spine to deal with the global forces ranged against us. Okay. It is possible for us to do it because you have numbers which are vastly superior to several Buddhist countries. You still have a standing army, which is among the, let's say, the biggest in the world. You still have such a huge landmass. And notwithstanding the rapid rate of demographic inversion, you still have numbers in your favor as on date. Okay.
Yeah.
Assuming that we are at 75% today and not the 80% that we are being told on a regular basis,
Yeah.
you're looking at 75% of 1.3 billion.
Yeah.
Okay. That's such a huge number compared to perhaps the Jewish population.
Right.
The Jewish population in the entire world is 12.5 million. Okay.
Yeah. Million.
And out of which a significant portion of it lives in America, and only about, let's say, 70 to 80% lives in Israel. Israel's population is about 8.5 million, and only 6.5 million are Jews, and 2.5 million are Arabs. Okay.
Correct.
So what is it that we seem to constantly gripe about, which the Jews aren't griping about?
Yeah.
Okay.
Correct. Right.
I don't think it's a question. Numbers certainly matter, but more than that, I think it's a clarity in vision that is called for.
Right. One question, looking at it from the Western viewpoint, most writing on decoloniality and the impact of colonial views on the colonized, a lot of the writing has also come from the Christian West. Now, what is the reason why they are not able to improve their own standards of understanding the damage they are doing? Why is a guy who wants to convert everybody inside not able to see the damage he is doing, and not able to see that, okay, let's assume tomorrow the whole world becomes Muslim or Christian. Where do you think that will end? What good does that deliver? Have they not asked this basic question of themselves to understand what damage they're doing? It's like this. If I'm seeing daily the destruction of forests, sooner or later I realize that this is affecting me, right? It's affecting my own well-being. In the same case, they know they have all this literature which they have developed through their own thought process. But they don't ask themselves a basic question: am I doing damage to myself by trying to make everybody like me, when I know that my own civilization failed in many aspects?
The answer to that question is slightly ontological, and I hope I'm giving an answer which is closer to what is perhaps the right answer. As a community, the Dharmic community believes in creating heaven on earth, whereas the Abrahamic communities are waiting for heaven elsewhere. Okay. Yeah. And therefore, according to them, the lives that they're leading right now is merely a pit stop on the way to greater glory. Okay. So they really don't care about what happens to the society here as long as their divinely ordained obligations are fulfilled, because they are doing so under the belief that they'll be rewarded elsewhere. Okay. They're very, very convinced of that. See, if you are in a position to create a suicide bomber who's willing to blow himself up under the belief that he's going to get sent to virgins in some other place, that is the kind of mentality that you're dealing with. Okay. Right. They are very clearly convinced of the fact that what they're doing is not evil, but is for the greater good of the entire humanity. Okay. Yeah. And if it comes at the expense of nature, that is the will of God. If it comes at the expense of genocide, that is the will of God. If it comes at the expense of, let's say, babies being killed or women being gang raped, that is the will of God. Okay. So if this is the extent to which you've convinced yourself of your vision, the only language that such a mindset effectively understands and is willing to respond to is the language of force and power. If you think you can argue with them, it's almost as good as arguing with someone. It's like Gandhi trying to, let's say, convert Hitler. Okay. That is something that's not going to happen under any circumstances. You can call him my dear brother, write him 1,000 different letters and start, let's say, a love relationship through your love letters. But at the end of the day, that's not going to yield any kind of results. Okay. Right. He is convinced of the moral superiority and the ethnic superiority of his position. And you cannot convert him unless and until someone is born with a filter, or because of experience, so to speak, has managed to grow a filter which asks the right questions, which is in the minority as far as both these mentalities are concerned. You will not be in a position to convince them under any circumstances. Right. That's not going to happen.
Yeah, right. So let me ask you 2 or 3 questions related to your own legal background. I mean, if much of our constitution and our laws, from the IPC to CRPC to everything, has come from colonial ideas, isn't there a serious case for rethinking and rewriting the whole thing, or do you feel we should do it piecemeal?
So, in this regard, Nelson Maldonado Torres, one of the scholars whose works that I have referred to in the book, comes out with potential solutions for such communities which are trying to begin their decolonial journeys. Okay. He says the one thing that you can do is to uproot the colonial infrastructure root and branch. Okay. And you go about establishing structures based on your own ontology, epistemology, and theology. He makes that very clear position.
Right.
But the alternative could be, if you believe that considerations of pragmatism, social cost, and other costs come in the way of the first exercise, then the second exercise is retain the body, change the spirit. Okay. So, which means for every word that you choose to use, please come out with creative definitions based on your own sources. Okay. So so this goes back to what you said previously. Can we redefine secularism in accordance with Bharat's civilizational thinking? Can we redefine religion? Can we redefine what is development? How do we choose to recalibrate our relationship with nature? Because I've hinted very clearly at the destructive relationship that coloniality enjoys with nature, where it effectively believes that the only way to materially prosper is by destroying nature.
That's right.
And how they're forced to actually rethink, because they realize that this is leading to irreversible change as far as the planet is concerned. Okay. So Bharat can undertake two options depending on its political will and other considerations, which is, how do I revamp the structure from the outside and from within? Or how do I try and come out with a certain hybrid model, with the hybridity tilting significantly in favor of indigenous consciousness and perhaps 20-30% in favor of colonial consciousness, only for the purposes of preventing isolation from the rest of the world? Because you obviously have to deal with those realities also.
Right.
From economics to other realities, you need to work. So if that is the case, how do we strike a balance?
Right. I know that as a practicing lawyer, you have to hope that the judiciary ultimately understands these issues and start taking corrective actions, whether it is in terms of redefining the scope of or understanding of Articles 25 to 30, or even the Sabarimala issue, which is languishing in the court somewhere, and the rights of deities, which you have mentioned so often. But if I may ask you a loaded question, if you want, you can hedge it. To what extent do you think the higher judiciary itself is capable of decolonializing its mind and approach? Why does it take us some decades after the Shirur Mutt judgment that we still don't think that it needs to be applied across temples, and that it's not that one temple at a time has to fight? So you first do Shirur Mutt, then you do Chidambaram, then you do Padmanabha Swami. Why is it that they think that 1 lakh temples have to be freed temple by temple rather than through a principle that's been laid down in Shirur Mutt?
Right. So I'll try and give perhaps a provocative response to this. So what I'll do is, there are two situations. One situation involving the judiciary, okay. We will proceed on the premise that the judiciary is thoroughly infected with colonial consciousness. Let's proceed on the particular premise. Okay.
Right.
Now, assume that the judiciary is heavily skewed in favor of the colonial worldview, and you remove them from this discussion altogether on temple freedom for a moment. Okay.
Right.
And let us have this discussion only within the Hindu society, not listening to anybody else, only within practicing Hindus for a moment.
Right.
Can you confidently say that all Hindus agree that freedom of temples is important?
Certainly not, because we are lazy enough to say, I don't need to do anything about it. I am happy just going and praying.
Not just that. At the very least, 30% of Hindus have bought into the notion that temples are less corrupt under the state and will be more corrupt in private hands.
That's right. Correct.
Okay.
I think somebody has planted this idea, and we seem to believe in this, that we ourselves are more corrupt than what we are.
Exactly. Because one is, they immediately say, if temples are free, it will go back to the corrupt Brahmin. One, there will be casteist domination. And second, there will also be corruption. That is the assumption which the current society operates under. Yeah. So before I actually cast certain aspersions on the judiciary, I'd ask myself, is there societal consensus to a significant extent on the subject? Because you see, the one thing that, let's say, in most jurisdictions, every arm of the state and every organ of the state certainly responds to is societal will and societal consensus.
Yes, correct.
When you know for a fact that the society is very clear about certain issues and there are certain non-negotiables which it will not put up with, every arm of the state, and I underscore every arm of the state, will have to take that into account before it passes any verdict on anything. Okay.
Right.
It so happens that today we are looking at the judiciary as an organ which is independently suffering from colonial consciousness, when in fact the entire society is buried under layers of colonial consciousness. After all, we are not being given airdrop judges or airdrop members of the judiciary. They are products of the society and the very same education system. How do you expect them to be different from us when it comes to this issue?
That's right.
Okay.
Correct.
So one of the things, and this is an extremely central premise of the book, and which is what Professor Mignolo pointed out in response to my book also when he reviewed the book, that as much as decoloniality is an endeavor that the state is supposed to embark upon, it is primarily a societal exercise.
Yeah.
The society needs to start, and the state will need to aid that process simply because the state has resources which can create a multiplier effect.
That's okay. Correct.
So long as there is an idea which is germinated in the society, and the state is given the responsibility of broadcasting it, the chances of that particular message being disseminated better are higher instead of a top-down approach. In fact, in this regard, I've said one more thing, which is citing Radhakumar Mukherjee's book and his conclusions. I've given a few conclusions and extrapolations. I've clearly said that what separates our society from the Western model is that we don't believe in a top-down imposition. We actually start with a ground-up acceptance, which is why custom and achara have such serious hold on people even today, whether it's 2021 or 2051. Hopefully, that should be the nature of the society still. Okay. So if decoloniality becomes an endeavor which is, let's say, pushed by societal institutions, societal groupings, so to speak, then the state will be forced to respond to this at some stage. Yeah. Because you see, for the state to act, let's say in the current setup, it needs a political incentive or an electoral incentive. Right, it cannot become an incentive unless and until the society turns it into an incentive.
Correct. I agree. I mean, I think there's a huge amount of work left for people who make these ideas popular and things like that. So coming to the last one or two questions, basically from what our conversation so far, I get the view that you want to make changes brick by brick rather than something that's like creating a second republic or a rewritten constitution, right?
No, I would say that a second republic is something that we must certainly aim for. Okay.
Yeah.
In my aspiration and in my ability to ideate, I certainly go for, let's say, the most, the ideal situation. So I'm saying the goal is a very clear second republic. Okay. I have no doubts about it. And I'm also very clear about the fact that if, let's say, the political establishment and the societal establishment can look at a complete revamp in one go, fantastic. But precisely because we are not there anywhere, we are nowhere close to that particular position, I'm forced to adopt an incremental approach at this stage.
That's right. Yeah, correct. Right. So, just a short glimpse of the second and third book. What will the second one focus on?
So, the first book effectively captures the period between 1492 and 1919-1920. The second book will capture the period between 1920 and 1951, covering three important milestones. First is the Government of India Act of 1935, which is effectively the basis for the Constitution, of course. And then the the Independence Act of 1947, and therefore the Constitution of 1950. And 1951, which is the first amendment to the Constitution, where two things happened: land reforms and the curtailment of free speech by enlargement of restrictions on free speech under the Nehru government supported by Dr. Ambedkar. So these are the three milestones that I'll cover in the second book. The third book will cover the period between 1952 and at the very least, previously I thought it would be 1977, but I'll take it to 1992. Until at the very least until 6th of December 1992. So the idea is from the first general elections to what I believe is a civilizational shift.
You won't come to the Ram Mandir judgment that far?
Depends. It's a function of my time, so to speak. But at the very least, I'm looking at the 42nd Amendment. I'm looking at insertion of secularism. I'm looking at the Mandal report. I'm looking at the treatment of caste, all these issues. Because you see, there are so many milestones to pick and choose from. So I'm only going to choose those milestones which, let's say, clearly fit in the narrative that I wish to present, which is to see whether we have reduced colonial consciousness or have we pushed ourselves greater into the arms of colonial consciousness.
Right. So as an aside, since you mentioned the First Amendment, are you a supporter of unbridled free speech, or do you feel that First Amendment was probably necessary at that particular time when our institutions were fragile?
I'm certainly not in favor of unbridled free speech, and I'm not drawing from the constitution in this regard. I'm drawing from dharmic ethos in this particular regard.
That's correct.
Okay.
Yeah.
But I'm certainly asking myself, firstly, whether the First Amendment was politically motivated or were there other intentions.
Yeah.
Clearly, they were politically motivated because Nehru's land reform vision, as well as the manner in which he was pushing it, was objected to by the Marxists in the first place, the communists in the first place.
Right.
Ramesh Thakur was actually writing against Nehru. Okay.
Yeah.
And Ramesh Thakur was not a Sanghi, and he was certainly not right of center. He was left of center, avowed left of center. Okay.
Right.
So the Congress, its relationship with, let's say, the Marxists and the left is very different from what it was in the 1950s. So therefore, I want to ask myself, when we constantly celebrate Sri Nehru's contributions towards free speech, why don't we discuss his role in the abridgment of free speech? That's one.
Correct.
And second, abridgment of free speech, the devil always lies in the detail as to whether that abridgment is broad in nature or is it specific in nature. Okay. And the criticism with respect to the First Amendment has been that it is all-encompassing.
Yeah.
Okay. And which gives the state a significant amount of latitude. So in that sense, I am perhaps a fairly decent champion of responsible free speech.
Yeah.
Okay. And I don't mean, therefore, that jokes and spoof don't have any value. I'm merely saying that free speech within the bounds respected by the civilization as a civilization in all its years of existence and all its millennia of existence should have been the basis for any amendment, if at all. But political considerations were clearly the motive behind the 1951 amendment.
Right. Just one line answer. I mean, would you favor an anti-blasphemy law? Because right now we are the only victims of it. The Islamists are able to impose their own will on society. If you blaspheme against their ideas, Christians can probably do it. Only Hindus seem to be the victims of not having such a law.
So the law as it exists is agnostic to religious beliefs.
That's
so
right.
it can be across the board. The thing that is actually hampering perhaps the Hindu society is that it certainly doesn't have extra constitutional vetoes like other communities.
Right.
Okay. And therefore you are forced to, let's say, comply with whatever the state says, unfortunately. So I am basically saying, if this is what has to happen, then we might as well do away with the blasphemy law altogether and let us have a free for all as far as this discussion is concerned. Why should I fight with one hand, and in fact, both hands tied to my back?
Right. Sai Deepak, it was a pleasure talking to you. And I hope the book does well. How has it done so far?
So from whatever I've heard, and touchwood, I think it's done exceedingly well. It has been consistently in the top 20 books ever since the pre-order link was launched on July 7th. And it has been consistently in the top 2 books in the political categories on Amazon. And from whatever I have heard so far, at the very least, I think it has sold about 15 to 20,000 copies in the first run and within a month of its launch. And I'm being very conservative in this regard. And I hope to actually push it as much as possible simply because I'm confident of the product that I have put out. Yeah. And I certainly believe that whether it is good or bad, that is for posterity to decide. It certainly has the potential to trigger conversations, and that's the intention.
Absolutely. And I think it has and it will. But I think you should probably get it an abridged version published in Indian languages. Maybe
translations are being considered. Both translations as well as audibles are being considered. So since the reception has been, if I may say so myself, has been extremely positive, it has given the publisher the incentive to seriously consider translations in Indic languages.
Okay, I think you have to look at the translations because one of the main objects of the book is to make sure that nothing gets mistranslated in Hindi or Tamil or whatever it is. Yes. Sai Deepak, thanks a lot. It's always a pleasure talking to you. And viewers, please do consider buying this book. This is a great book. You must read this. I really hope you will be enlightened by this. Thank you very much. Namaskar.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, sir.